Welcome to the Jersey Barrier. Ryan here. Today we are going to take a look at Virginia, and specifically Northern Virginia, to discuss how I-95 has become such a nightmare in and around the Washington, D.C. metro area. Before we begin, I do want to shout out DMAC6004 for the idea for this video. Thank you. Alright, diving into it. We start with the big one, Interstate 95, Maine to Florida, on the East Coast, and a whole lot of states. Specifically in Virginia, the first big place coming out of the south is Petersburg, outside of Richmond, and it crosses into Maryland in Alexandria. If you're more interested in this, check out the video in the top right, which discusses this exact section from last week. I-81 is of significant importance in Virginia, the most mileage in the state. 81 runs up to Canada and down to Knoxville in Virginia, Bristol at the line, up to Winchester, one of VDOT's favorite places to sign of all time. Moving to I-64, starting in Norfolk, it runs through Richmond and goes into rural Western Virginia and rural West Virginia. Last place it goes to in Virginia is Covington, but does go all the way to St. Louis. And a small one up in Nova, I-66, just runs from Strasburg at I-81 to DC. Alright, so here is the summary of these interstates with some US and state highways of note in the state for this video. Please note I did not include I-77, I-85, or any spur routes on this map because they are not relevant to the discussion today, nor US Route 1 as it is parallel to 95. So the 95 congestion is really only an issue north of Richmond, where I-95 and I-64 intersect. I-64 to I-81 is a pretty easy alternative if you are going somewhere in central Pennsylvania or anywhere north of that, as I-81 is completely toll-free everywhere, and 95 is not. But if you need to get to Nova, DC, Baltimore, Wilmington, or Philly, 95 is gonna be the fastest route for you. Alright, so VDOT has tried to address this issue by adding some express lanes in Northern Virginia. While these HOT lanes have brought some relief, many drivers do not want to pay the toll that these require. And another issue is that they are interchangeable and not always available, depending on the direction. Back to the overall scale of I-95. There's never going to be an easy alternative to Baltimore, Wilmington, or Philly. So you're going to have to take 95. So reducing congestion to routes elsewhere has to be the focus. So this line here follows pretty closely with 95 near Richmond, but then 95 veers completely east as it gets further north. Yes, obviously to get to DC, but what about the people that live on that line to the north? Let's take a look at where that veering east happens, which happens right here. Where is that, you may ask? That brings us to Fredericksburg, Virginia, located on the 95 corridor, as well as the Rappahannock River. So looking at Fredericksburg and just outside of the city, we have I-95, as well as three pretty major US routes. This is going to be pretty important to note. The other end of that white line in Virginia brings us to the booming suburban town of Leesburg. Leesburg has US 15 running right through it. You may notice that route was just outside of Fredericksburg as well. So, looking at a slightly larger scale, the routes between Fredericksburg and Leesburg. Notice Fredericksburg has I-95 and US 17, while Leesburg has US 15, which US 17 runs directly to. However, let's bring back that white line from earlier. Here is that line with the ideal route between Fredericksburg and Leesburg. Obviously, it would be ideal to build a highway right through here, which would obviously relieve congestion and provide a faster route. But it's it's not always that easy. In this path, we have the Marine Corps base Quantico, as well as the FBI Academy and General Presence, a historic military park in Manassas, and the major international airport in Dulles. So let's look at our two real route options, accounting for the current infrastructure. East of the line, we have I-95 to any combination of Virginia state routes and parkways. West of the line, we have US 17 to US 15. From the look of these lines, which are certainly not perfect, it does not look like the western route could, or it does look like the western route could be faster. So using current average drive times from Google Maps, let's see. And note the eastern is almost all controlled access highway, where the west is typically rural federal highway. So looking at weekend, non-peak, and commuter peak hours. During non-peak hours, the range is so much wider for the west because of traffic, lights, crossings, etc., as compared to the east, but there's quite an overlap there, as you can see. So how about commute times? The east is almost certainly longer than the non-peak, but how about the west is pretty much the same. So Google did suggest the eastern route for both times, but we will come back to this issue in a few moments. But I'm sure some of you are saying, what about the metro? People should take public transit. Then it'll relieve congestion. Okay. So DC does have a metro. This map is pretty terrible. There's no reference to scale at all. So let's pull out this map. Much better. So obviously the center of that is DC, but let's overlay this onto our map of the highways. Now this overlay is not great, but you can see it doesn't really help people west of Dulles Airport or south of Woodbridge. And the DC Metro as a whole does not have a fantastic reputation. In reality, a line should run all the way to Fredericksburg, down where 17 splits off from 95. But we are the Jersey Barrier. We talk about roads. There's no Jersey Barrier on railroads. Okay, so understanding the basics of the shortcomings of the Metro, as well as the problems with I-95 congestion, I have some alternatives to consider. Prop 1 introduces a spur, I-995. This is the best case scenario for an alternate 295 to the far northwest suburbs of DC, like Leesburg, Ashburn, Manassas, and Sterling. It would almost certainly reduce drive time for residents of those suburbs, which are all massive. As for commuters to DC, the 995 to 66 East route could be a viable alternative for a commute, as it would be slightly more distance, but with a projected reduction in traffic, could very well be faster, depending on which part of DC or Northern Virginia that you'd be going to. However, there are some very obvious issues with this proposition. Let's take a look at Bealton, Virginia, and Fauquier County. So this is right before 15 and 17 become concurrent, and you can see 17, first leg of proposed 995, runs right through a downtown type area with businesses right on the highway, as you can see here. This would be incredibly costly for the government to build with or around, as they often have to buy out some properties, which could cripple the local economy. However, we take a look at Warrenton, Virginia, where 15 and 17 split right after their concurrency, and it is much better set up to be compliant with FHA standards with those on-off ramps and interchange with US 211. So this is definitely a candidate to be an interstate, and just leave the 17 from 15 to 95 as is. So, this brings me to Prop 2 with I-266. where 266 will run from just after Bealton, as we saw, all the way up to Frederick, Maryland, ideally. This is not to say we will not run into some similar problems as we saw in Bealton, as there's still some of that, especially just before the 66 interchange with current US 15. But the infrastructure is certainly there in Leesburg, as 15 becomes the Leesburg bypass, which is controlled access up there. So, in summary, or the 95 congestion problem, there's really only three options that I see. Prop 1, I-95, which would be incredibly costly, and many residents would absolutely hate the state for years to come, but it would definitely reduce commute time and solve the problem. That's not a sacrifice that I'm willing to make, and I don't think any governor would either. As for Prop 2, with I-266, this is basically Prop 1, but just a little less mad people, but also less benefit for congestion reduction, as 17 is still a signalized intersection and federal highway from Fredericksburg to Bealton. And Prop 3, I don't really have a strong plan here, but just a general improvement of the DC Metro, but that's a totally different situation than dealing with highways. I'm sure if DC Metro were to improve, then it would relieve congestion like we're trying to see the MTA and NYC do up in New York City right now. So what do you think about this problem with I-95 in Virginia? I know it's a huge issue, and I really didn't focus about the urban congestion relief aspect, but I think a large-scale fix is all that will genuinely reduce congestion, because people will still need to drive into the city if they're living that close. What has your experience with I-95 been like in Virginia or other states? Let us know in the comments, and once again, thanks to DMAX6004 for the suggestion, and thank you all for watching. Have a good one.